Thank you so much for being here. I'm Sarah Stanlick. I'm one of the co-directors of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative and have been really grateful and appreciative of my wonderful team who have been working over the last year to reinvigorate and just enliven our webinar offerings. And we're so thankful to Dr. Vandermaas-Peeler and Dr. Whitehead, who are going to be speaking with us today about mentored undergraduate research in global contexts. So I will give a brief overview of these two wonderful women. Dawn Whitehead is the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at the American Association of Colleges and Universities. Her office focuses on advancing practices and strategies to integrate an equitable participation in global learning, integrative learning, community-based learning, and experiential learning, so many learnings, across curricular and co-curricular initiatives to prepare students for life, work, citizenship, and being whole beings. She also serves as the program director of AAC&U's annual meeting and draws on the broader work of AAC&U members and contemporary issues in higher education to create a compelling and timely meeting on the things that matter to all of us. And I know that many of you have experienced AAC&U gatherings and know just how fruitful and informative that space is. And also, we have with us of Elon University, Maureen Vandermaas-Peeler, who is a professor of psychology who came to Elon in 1995. She does a lot of interesting work on everything from informal learning and play in early childhood to adult guidance of children's inquiry and discovery, sociocultural and global contexts of learning, and of course, undergraduate research mentoring. And she and Dawn have been working on this work for a few years and have published some really interesting insights that they're going to share with us today. And so just a few other things. Maureen directed the honors program at Elon from 2008 to 2013. You've done research seminars on excellence in mentoring undergraduate research. So this work is definitely well mobilized and rooted in some important learning that you all have done in your research. And you're also, well, I'll pause there. Maureen, you're amazing. Dawn, you're amazing. I'm going to let you do the talking. Is there anything else, Mike, our wonderful managing director, that I needed to remember before we get started?
We have a few links we'll drop into the chat about the collaborative generally so that folks could explore other events that are happening too.
Yep. Thank you so much. Yeah, and this is going to be partially interactive too. So if you're bringing your context, your expertise, interesting insights, I'll be monitoring the chat and try to make sure that we can have a productive discussion as well. But be ready for a really engaging webinar from Maureen and Dawn. So I'll kick it over to you both to get started.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for being here today. Maureen and I are really glad to be with you today and are looking forward to hearing from you and learning from you as well. So first, just so you have an idea of what we have planned for the next hour and a half, we want to have an opportunity for some welcome and introductions. And so again, we welcome you to go to that Miro board link to introduce yourself, to put some information there. We're going to talk about what MUR-GC or MUR-GC, depending on how you pronounce it, what it is, how it's deeply connected to high impact practices and the integration of those practices. And then we want to share some of our findings. We had 3 specific groups that were exploring these areas. One was focused on research, one was focused on intercultural dimensions, and the other on inclusive practices. And so we want to share some of the work that we've done in those spaces. And then we want to talk with you about the implications for community engaged learning. And then we'll be sharing some resources as well. So first, before we get deeply into that Miro board, I want to get your fingers moving. And we want to ask, if you think about all of these aspects of MUR-GC, would you say, firstly, that you have more experience with undergraduate research or doing work in a global context? So if you can do the hand clap for undergraduate research or a thumbs up for global context, just so we can kind of get an idea. Okay, so we've got quite a few, it looks like, in the global context. Okay, a few. Okay, great. All right, next. Okay, I think we caught everybody. Okay, thank you. Chat is great too. Thank you, Rami. We see that. Next one, when you think about it, is, would you say you have more experience with undergraduate research or mentoring? And again, it could be the same, but we want to just get a sense of where we are. Okay, so we've got a lot of mentoring folks in the group. Okay, lots with mentoring experience. Okay, excellent. Okay, we see Raquel, one with undergraduate research. Okay. All right. And next, we would like to see if you, when you think about mentored undergraduate research, do you have experience with one-on-one mentoring, more experience, or more experience with team mentoring? So we're going to act like the slide didn't change. So one-on-one mentoring, clap, a thumbs up for team mentoring. Okay, so we've got, okay, oh, this is a nice mix. Okay, we've got a nice mix. Okay, excellent. And then last, within this particular context, when you are thinking about doing undergraduate research in a global context, has that been done locally or has it been done internationally? So a hand clap if you've done a lot of global context work in a local context, thumbs up if it's been in an international context. Okay, so again, great. Okay, we've got a great mix. All right, we look forward to hearing about these different experiences that you've had. So now we want to get a deeper understanding of what you're hoping to get from today and also find out sort of who you are, where you're coming from. And you know, I'm a Hoosier. I usually lead with that. I can't believe I didn't do that today. So I'm from Indiana, educated at Indiana University, long ties, family ties to the state and to the university. And Saturday I had the wonderful opportunity, some may say, to go to an IU basketball game. And you know, you never know who's there. You know, you don't know who are they fans, are they alums, did they come to hate watch, you know, with the situation we're in now. We know none of you are here for hate participating, but we would just like to get a sense of who's in the Zoom. So if you could go over to the Miro board, we want to know what your role is at the institution. We'd also like to know what your experience is with MUR-GC. And then thirdly, we'd like to know what you're hoping to get out of today's session. So we will go over to the Miro board and take a look there. So we'll share that screen so you can see it, and feel free to just click on the post-it, and you can let us know what your role is. If you're having trouble with the Miro board, feel free to put that information in the chat. So we'll be looking at the chat and on the board. Okay, so we can just get a sense of who's here, and hopefully that will also foster conversation and collaboration as well among folks that are here. Okay, so thank you for doing this. Okay, looks like, okay, we've got some faculty. All right, biology, excellent. Okay, Director of Italian Programs, Public Engagement. Okay, staff members, wonderful. Okay, an Assistant Vice President of Global Learning and Professor of International Education. Okay. Assistant Director, Social Justice and Student Leadership. Okay, so we've got a nice range. Okay, education faculty. First year, okay, PBL, Global Programs and Faculty, excellent. Director of Global, okay, thank you. So this gives us a nice look at who's with us. Okay, so this will also be important as we're talking about the different roles that people play in MUR-GC. Program Manager, excellent, someone who's running. All right, now we'll just take a quick look at this and then get into the content. What is your experience with MUR-GC so we're able to see who's been involved? Oh, and thank you. Sorry, I missed one in the chat. Okay, International Education Academic Director in Cameroon, wonderful. Retired, okay, but previously Educational Programs in the Community. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Now, if we can look at your experience with MUR-GC. And I'm moving this slightly, so hopefully you can see this. If not, we can reshare. I'll do a little highlight, but you can see it on your screen. So, okay, some have none in global, lots in undergraduate mentoring, excellent. International projects, Uruguay, Belize, worked with students abroad, used SDG framework with international students as well, thank you. Community-based learning, excellent. Team-based global PBL, okay, first year programs. Okay, excellent. Okay, so this gives us a good sense. And then we will keep an eye on the third, what do you want to learn from today's session? And we'll go back to this to make sure we have, you know, we're addressing the topics that you want to raise. All right, thank you. Okay, thank you. And I see you're sharing as well. Mentor, undergraduate, mentor, and graduate, so both levels. All right, excellent. So we'll come back to the main room, and we'll come back to our main session. And then we just want to give you a very, very quick overview of how we got here. And so the pathway to getting to looking at the integration of these high impact practices started at Elon University. And it started during a Cell Summer program that both Maureen and I were presenting. And Maureen was presenting on her work. She'll mention this throughout the presentation, her work in Hawaii. And, I was doing a presentation on global learning and having a broad understanding of what global learning was. And then we said, hey, Maureen approached me and said, have you ever thought about the integration of these practices? So a little time went by, Maureen reached back out, and then we said, okay, let's get this going. Let's see what other people are doing, because there was a lot of research on the individual high impact practices, but we didn't find much on the integration of the practices. So we started reaching out to people at different institutions who were doing this work, and we had an initial think tank in October of 2019, and we brought together about 20 folks who were doing this work in independent ways, and then we started having conversations. We plan to continue that dialogue at the Forum on Education Abroad, because we thought that's another organization that has a lot of perspective and folks might be engaging in these practices. That, of course, was delayed because of COVID. But we did a virtual think tank a little bit later. And then we decided, after we started sort of looking at these practices, we had about 30 or so folks that were involved. We developed 3 working groups that were dedicated to looking at the research gaps. So what are the gaps in the literature? One that was looking at inclusive practices, and then another that looked at the intercultural dimensions. And so the working groups all worked independently on different projects, coming together to, keeping each other informed. We had a convening on that group, and then we developed this research. We started doing research for this publication, Mentored Undergraduate Research in Global Context, and we'll put this in the chat as well. Again, this is a free download and has a lot of information. And then now Maureen and I are working on another publication on this work, and we've got some case studies, some examples from around the world. So that's sort of what brought us to looking at the integration of these 3 high impact practices and how we can go forward with this work. So I'm going to turn it over to Maureen now to situate the work in the high impact practice space.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dawn. That was a nice overview. And I want to reiterate something we've been saying in the beginning of this, which is if you have questions, comments, a topic occurs to you that you wish we would talk more about or that you want to talk about, just put it in the chat, and Sarah and Dawn and Mike are helping us as we take turns talking today. And I just accidentally advanced the slides too. Thanks, Mike, for the control. I should pay attention to what I'm doing. So this slide is probably very familiar to you. Obviously, we have been talking a lot in higher education about these high impact practices. And as Dawn mentioned, often people are really working within one of them, or thinking primarily about one of them, but we know that there are synergies. And actually, if you feel like it and you would like to note, I didn't touch anything that time. Okay, the intersections, Mike, I might need your help. Go back. I sort of have control of the screen, but maybe not really. Okay, so which ones are you working in primarily? And you were doing a little bit of this with Dawn, so some of you are really coming at this with lots of experience in undergraduate research, for example. The 3 up here, in the corner, community-based learning, research, and diversity and global learning are among the primary high-impact practices we're talking about today. And again, what's the potential for learning across these intersections? How are we understanding where there's even, depth and breadth together? So maybe if you want to put in the chat, the intersections of high impact practices you've engaged, we could think about this even more broadly. But for MUR-GC, and by the way, we know that's awkward. We haven't quite been able to figure out a better acronym that could be like you win a prize if you help us with that. But I'll just go ahead and say MUR-GC for mentored undergraduate research. And so mentoring is not here, but we see it actually as really important for quality. So Mike, if you don't mind advancing the screen for me, it doesn't seem to be working. Thank you. Essential qualities of high quality, the indicators are here, sorry. So 8 different ways that Koo and O'Donnell specify that we really want to be thinking about high quality. And for us in this project, we're thinking a lot about mentoring as a way of doing some of this work here. So for example, offering feedback, helping students with structured opportunities to integrate their learning and for reflection. We know these are very important when students are away from campus as well as on campus. So these quality indicators, we just are reminding everybody that this is something important. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we want to lay out a few definitions. We looked to the national organizing bodies for these definitions. You'll see that on each of these slides. So very quickly, I'll just go over the Council on Undergraduate Research, or CUR, just revised their definition recently, and they put out a statement first that basically says, we want to remind everybody that UR, scholarship, and creative inquiry, these are all fundamentally pedagogical approaches, and that's what we're thinking about here, teaching and learning. And so with an emphasis on process, what is UR? Well, it's a mentored investigation or creative inquiry conducted by undergrads that seeks to make a contribution to knowledge. So that's a definition we work with. However, on the next slide, we want to show you a definition that Kate Patch and Lou Behrens came up with, which is really looking at UR abroad. We, in our project, use the term global because, as you noted from Don's questions, we think about local context, obviously, as global. But in this book, they're looking at undergraduate research in connection with study abroad. So I highlighted in green here a couple of key phrases, again, guided by mentorship, and then thinking about engagement with a variety of stakeholders. And we recommend this book if you haven't taken a look at it. They do a number of case studies with programs you might be familiar with or might not. And so it's actually a nice look at UR abroad. And then we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so defining global learning, we looked, of course, at AAC&U, and through the process of developing these rubrics, the value rubrics, they define global learning in this way. So critical analysis of and engagement with complex interdependent systems. I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, but and the implications for people's lives and for sustainability. And on the next slide, Dawn is going to show you a more recent definition that a couple of scholars, one of whom I think is on our call today, maybe, Hilary Landorf, did some work here. So Don, do you want to say a little bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. One of the things about the work that we do at AAC&U is the definition that Maureen shared was developed as part of our global learning value rubric, and that was created about 15 years ago. And one of the things that we have often encouraged folks to do with the value rubrics is to individualize them, to make changes that are relevant for your local context. And one of the things that we have been very fortunate, as Maureen mentioned, Hilary Landorf is a senior fellow at AAC&U, and she and her colleague Stephanie Dasher had developed a definition of global learning that many of us were already using. And in 2023, they made a change to the definition. And so you can see from this framing, global learning is the process of diverse people collaboratively analyzing and addressing complex problems that transcend borders and engaging in actions that promote collective well-being. And this really reflects, this addition in bold, it really reflects what many institutions are doing and what they mean by global learning, that it's not global learning for learning's sake, it's global learning for the collective good or for the public good. And so we like to share this framing of global learning as it is more timely and reflective of where we are now. And so this is also the framing we use for MUR-GC. And as Maureen mentioned, Hilary is on here, so I'm sure she's open to taking any questions about that framing.
Yeah, so Hilary, if you want to jump in, feel free. Okay, and so going to the next slide. Thank you, Mike. And I also just guess I want to say in the chat, we see that folks are talking about using local global with community-based learning in undergraduate research and being assigned a faculty mentor. That's great. That's a very good example. And we'll maybe ask you, Felicia and Sarah, to share examples as we come into discussion. So this work, this slide is really highlighting the importance of mentoring. So in my work at Elon University, for a couple of years, I co-led a project that we called Mentoring Matters, or Mentoring for Learner Success. It was in conjunction with ACE's Learner Success Project. And so we were in that pilot group of 10 institutions right in 2020. So we met entirely on Zoom for a couple of years with about 9 other institutions. But at Elon, we centered our work around mentoring. as really critical for student success. So if you were working in higher ed in 2014, I'm sure you remember this this Gallup Purdue Index report came out. And everybody remembers it because suddenly all of us started talking about mentoring and how can we understand it. And that's in part because only 25% of students, maybe even a little less, indicated that they did have a significant mentoring relationship with someone else, a faculty or staff member at the institution, which was already first, that was alarming. Why are there not more students engaged in these ways? But also the students the minority who reported having a mentoring relationship were more likely to be thriving and had indicators of well-being. So we have a more recent poll that came out of the Center for Engaged Learning. This is Jesse Moore's work here. And this poll found that graduates who had 7 to 10 significant relationships with faculty and staff were more than 3 times as likely to report their college experience as very rewarding. And they also were noting that they met 79% of the graduates reported meeting the peers who had the biggest impact on them during their first year of college. So we know that peers are important. Relationships with faculty and staff are very important. And this poll was a national poll, but it comes out of the Center for Engaged Learning, which we shortened to CEL if you hear us talking about that on this call. And so there is a significant body of research showing that indeed mentoring does matter. And so in the next slide, I will show that we developed a process through a process of engaging faculty and staff on our campus, thinking about how we want to define mentoring. One of the interesting things about mentoring, those of you working in UR especially know this, there isn't one common definition, although there are elements in common. So after a very significant literature review, we took a look at what we know about mentoring, starting with Kathy Cram's work in IO, psychology, and just thinking about the fact, yeah, that's great, Mike, that these are developmental and learner-centered relationships. And so Elon is characterized as a relationship-rich culture. Many of your institutions probably say the same. We're very student-focused. And our past president, Leo Lambert, and colleague Peter Felton wrote a book, came out right during the pandemic, about relationships mattering, relationship-rich education. So what does that look like? And so in the next 3 bullets, Mike, you can just pop them in there. Thank you. We're thinking about mentoring broadly construed here. So academic, social, personal, cultural, and career-focused and beyond. That certainly doesn't capture the entire breadth of mentoring, but it's meant to signal that we aren't just thinking about academic. We are thinking about whole people. And so this intentional, sustained, and integrative mentoring evolves over time. It's very important to think about the beginning of a relationship. When I work with students in undergraduate research, it's often a 2.5 year relationship. And of course, that looks very different at the start than it does as we work together. And it becomes even more, I would say, reciprocal. Reciprocity is very important. Those of us involved in the collaborative use this word a lot when we think about partnerships. But we also want to apply it to mentoring. So also this idea that there's mutual beneficial outcomes or processes for everyone involved in these relationships. Sometimes our colleagues push back a little bit on this notion of mutually beneficial. So we like to clarify, it doesn't mean equally, like I might not derive the same benefits, but if I wasn't deriving benefits from this very exhaustive, intensive work that I do with students, I certainly wouldn't have been doing as much of it as I do. So I benefit from working with students, from their identities, from their lived experiences. And that's probably obvious to most of us on the call, but we like to highlight that this really is important in relationships. And then again, individualized, so that we're thinking about everybody's needs as they're changing, they're dynamic. Mentors are certainly bringing expertise to these relationships. That's important to acknowledge, and then thinking about everybody's identities. And so the last bullet highlights here that at Elon, we are actually thinking about mentoring relationships in what we call a constellation model, so that students have relationships all around campus, through their lives at home. And so this broad set of relationships helps to support students. One mentor does not have to be the only person providing advice and expertise. So we can all learn from each other. This idea of a constellation is something we're highlighting in the resources slide. We'll show you on the Center for Engaged Learning web pages. We have been bringing some of this research we were doing through this campus self-study into the public sphere. So you can find a lot of our work there in blogs that we've been writing, Jesse Moore, Tim Peoples, and myself. So the next slide, thank you. As Dawn mentioned earlier, we just don't know that much from an empirical point of view, especially about what it looks like when students experience these high impact practices in integrated ways. So one publication we read called it Stacking HIPs. We published some work together with colleagues who had been working through, I direct the Center for Research on Global Engagement at Elon, and we've been building this community of practice model where we work together on projects, and a number of us were thinking about mentoring and MUR-GC in particular. So we wrote this paper that was published in Mentoring and Tutoring, highlighting some of the things you see here on the screen as really important. So global learning, obviously, cultural humility, something we cultivate with our students and our partners. Ethical engagement, I noticed that somebody added that either on the Miro board or in the chat, that you want to think about this ethical engagement and what does that look like. That's really important, obviously, in our cultural learning. And so through case studies of our work with students over many, many years, we've been highlighting some of these outcomes for students. But we certainly have much more to learn. Thanks, Mike. Next slide. So Dawn mentioned that we came together in a number of ways. We were meeting at conferences when that was possible. We formed think tanks, and through all of that, we highlighted some themes that we wanted to explore. And one of the first themes that people raised was this gap. There is a gap. We just don't know very much about the integration of global learning, of undergraduate research, of mentoring. And so we divided into these 3 teams that we'll talk about. And so I was part of this research working group, we called ourselves. And early on, we realized we just need to get some data. We need to know more about who's doing what are people experiencing. So this is the constitution of the team. And on the next slide, you'll see the topics that we identified as important. We created a national survey. I have to give a shout out to our colleague, Laura Cruz, who has done just so much work to get the survey ready, putting it into a format that would be easily shareable, et cetera. So these topics are here, and you've heard us mention most of them already today. These were the things we decided to focus on. We started compiling a list of questions. We took it to the think tank participants, and we would have had probably 400 questions. So we said, we probably need to narrow it. So we again, thanks in part to Laura's partnership, we were able to create what we thought was a manageable survey. We estimate it went out to listservs, Dawn, I think AAC&U, I think the Forum on Education, abroad. The Council on Undergraduate Research, we put it out there. So we tried to get the bodies of folks that we thought, were doing this work. In the end, we had, it may seem like a small number, but 144 responses, which really represented people from a variety of different roles and institution types. And so after, I'm not quite sure how long, but a few months, we closed the survey and began to look at the data we did gather. So on the next slide, you'll see one of the responses to our questions was these responses in terms of what types of global UR programs have you been involved in? And so looking at this, you can see that there's a breadth. So a lot of people mentioned one-to-one credit-bearing UR. Others said, we're doing course-embedded work. That's interesting. Sometimes we call that a CURE, the course-embedded undergraduate research experiences. Lab style, surprisingly, maybe a little smaller there. Short-term study abroad, and so forth. So you can see that people reported a diversity of ways that they are engaged with students in global UR. And on the next slide, you'll see that they also work with a diverse set of students. So we can see here, just this colorful graph shows you that all of these demographics were represented. So some of the students were in honors, some were first gen. We wondered if we would have a primarily STEM represented. We didn't. We had a variety. We had arts, we had humanities, social sciences, et cetera. So we do see this breadth, and that's really what we're meant to convey here. And I should also remind you, if you have a question or you want to make a comment, just jump in the chat and let me know. But I'm going to keep rolling through because we actually want to get to the discussion. So I know I'm speaking a little quickly, but on the next slide. This is something we do want to ask you to think about. And if you want to say, yeah, I assess certain learning outcomes when I'm doing this work, you could put it in the chat. We ask people with this list, which ones are you assessing as part of this? And so the first answer, technical skills, was the most frequent, which makes sense, right? These are UR projects often conducted within a particular disciplinary style. Disciplinary knowledge. Intercultural competence was 60% of people said they were assessing this, which we found encouraging. thinking about other cultures and so forth. So most people said, yep, we're assessing these SLOs. And so on the next slide, so if you have a different one or a way of assessing it, we'd love to see you put it in the chat and then certainly bring it into our discussion. So then we asked, how are you assessing these outcomes? And so most people were saying through direct measures. And then we also had other people doing these methods you see here. So sometimes focus groups or interviews. Validated surveys was relatively low. So again, could we develop tools that we could all use and share? That's certainly an idea that we think is coming out of this data. So I'm not looking, but I see 7 new messages. So let's see. Oh yeah, okay, thanks for populating that. Yep, some good comments about constellations. I love it. This is a concept I'm very excited about, as you could probably tell. Okay, so I think we can go to the next slide. And here the question is, well, okay, another need we heard people talking about was professional development. And so we were curious. This slide developed by my colleague Eric Hall shows us, let's compare intercultural learning and MUR-GC, because people had experiences in each of these areas, although of course they're overlapping. So what kinds of development? Professional meetings. Shout out to Dawn for the AAC&U Global Learning meeting, for example. That's a really great way to bring people together who are thinking and studying this work. And obviously through networking. I think it's interesting, the third line here, experiential practice or learning by doing. Some of us feel like we were just sort of thrown into this work. I was never taught how to mentor. I don't know about you. I had a fabulous undergraduate research mentor. And so I often find myself emulating Debbie Best at Wake Forest when I think about what I'm doing. But this idea that we just get in it and we're just doing it is coming up. So sometimes readings or short courses. And again, you see no training bolded here. We know that this is a need people have, and people have been talking about this in the mentoring sphere for quite a long time. And it's interesting to see it shows up also for intercultural learning. So again, if you've participated in particularly interesting trainings, you could put that in the chat and we could talk about it. And in the meantime, Mike, we can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. Yeah, professional societies, absolutely. Right, not consistent. Yeah, Sarah, feel free to say more about that if you want to now or maybe later in the discussion.
Yeah, I'll save it. I have a couple of maybe examples that I could bring up later.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to close out our discussion of the research part of the working group, we asked some open-ended questions in the survey, and we spent some time here really trying to understand what people's experiences were like. These were really interesting responses. A smaller number, we didn't get the full 144 participants, obviously, but we had, some interesting responses. So what are your strengths? We identified they could be personal, pedagogical, institutional. What's working well? What are the weaknesses? What kind of supports do you wish you had? And then what are your opportunities? What do you see as an opportunity in this work? And so on the next slide, you'll see the strengths. And often people were identifying their own personal strengths here. It's kind of interesting. We ended up using a Bronfenbrenner ecological model to analyze this, looking at people were really thinking about their work with students in dyadic or triadic or constellation. So what's working well? My ability to motivate students to carry out research in a respectful manner, in ways that are mutually beneficial. Lots of important words in that response. Helping students understand the context and different perspectives. Certainly this is an area where a mentor's expertise, not only in academia, but in the host communities. Seeing mentors really help students understand their own contexts is critical in this MUR-GC work. And then sharing relationships between my positionality and experience. I often join labs with another colleague at Elon because my colleagues' positionalities and experiences are quite different. And so we want our students to benefit from a diverse set of experiences. So even when it's on-campus research, we do this. Next slide looks at what did people identify then as weaknesses? And here people were really talking about institutional supports quite often, lack of support. So in a way, lack of support for my pedagogical work. So I don't see a lot about assignments and assessments that I could use. So is there a body of work we could all draw from? Feeling unprepared for the work because I don't have faculty development to support it. And then talking about the difficulty in recruiting diverse and economically this person's words, disadvantaged students, and then institutional support is important for access. And people, often this work does involve some travel, not always, obviously. We also think local communities, we can get students involved in our local communities. And then the last slide I'll show you about these open-ended questions is about what opportunities do you either see or want to have. And access comes up right away. We would like to see more opportunities for students across, my institution, reducing barriers to student participation. And then thinking again about how do we create a culture of support for this. I wish one person said that my efforts, my individualized efforts, and this was very common, I've built a program, but I wish it was somehow institutionalized. I wish I had support through a center, through administrative support, funding opportunities. So people are often using their own contacts, but not feeling a systematized program. And then this person noted that the global projects exploded since the pandemic. And so really trying to expand and develop these kinds of engagements. Yeah, thank you. Next slide. And so for you, you're here today for a particular reason. So what are the strengths that you are bringing to this work? Let's celebrate that. Let's learn from each other a little bit about what's working well. And then on the other hand, what support do you wish you had? Resources are always going to come up as an issue. And then what opportunities would you either like to see or do you know of that you could share? And again, feel free to put that in the chat. We're also going to come back and do a discussion about this after Dawn introduces a little bit more about the next working groups. So I think, Mike, the next slide. So again, feel free, please, and I'll be looking at chat while Dawn is speaking. And then in the next slide, I think we are going to go over to you, Dawn.
All right, thank you so much. And I think, thanks, Sarah, for responding to that question I'm seeing from Hillary about time, labor, and institutional context, because as Maureen talked about at Elon, there's an expectation of mentoring from faculty and staff. And so we can talk about that as well. So I want to share a little bit from our intercultural learning working group. And this was a group that was organized by Chris Atchison-Clare from Purdue University, at the SILMAR Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, and Research, and Susan Buck-Sutton, who was also the main facilitator for this group. They were joined by Lou Behrens from CEA Study Abroad and Jen Wiley from Core Collaborative. And so one of the things they did is they thought it was important to ask some questions of folks that were providing mentoring to students, both in the US context and in an international context. And one of the things that they found in this process, they interviewed 12 mentors. Again, some were based in the US, some were based outside the US, and they were involved with students in different roles. Some were faculty, some were program administrators, some were on-site coordinators, some were experts in other countries. And there were 8 dimensions they found that were quite important. And what you will see from those is one, and this makes sense. We have a lot of folks that are coming at this from the global context. Context matters. That's pretty clear that it was important to look at identity, positionality, and awareness, self-awareness. The issue where the topic of reciprocity came out, also equity and access in terms of participation, the ethics of doing this work, the need for a long-term process, the need for support for mentors, and revisiting what the expected student outcomes were. So I want to share a few quotes that were gathered from this project. And one of the things is this person said, in countries that have gone through historical trauma, political changes, dictatorships, that sometimes mean when students go to places, they have to understand that they can't just ask. And they have to understand those questions that you can't ask. And yet there's a curiosity to know. How do you balance that general interest the student might have with understanding the countries, if you will, and respecting those? And this came about in terms of not just the students being in a place, but the student being involved in undergraduate research, right? Because we're integrating all of these practices. It's not just having an experience in a country, but a student is trying to do research in a country, and they have to recognize what that broader context is and how they're engaging in the research, and can they do the type of research that they may want to. Another is looking at identity, positionality, and awareness. One, student self-awareness as cultural beings, the mentor's self-awareness as a cultural being, and how do people with different identities experience merging quite differently, because you may have a team of researchers, if it's a student research team, and they might have very different experiences in the global context, wherever that may be. So this came from one of the respondents. I think for some of our Black students who are going to Africa, it's a homecoming. I'm going home. And for them, sometimes it's eye-opening and a reality check when they get to a particular place and it's not what they thought it was going to be. But it's helping them to also think about their Blackness in different ways. In this interview, the person also talked about the students that did not think of going home, of being in the African context. And some of the folks they were researching who saw them as foreign, just like everyone else, if you will, in the language they use. And so making sure that when students are going into this, that they're aware of these aspects and dimensions. Another one is in terms of access. And this is one of the things in the publication you'll see we talk about. It's not just students, it's also faculty and staff, and how are they gaining access as well to these things, because we don't want to reproduce, things that are already in place. One example, this was in regards to rural students. So accepting rural students is a challenge, even internally for us as a university, and it's been a terrific and interesting experience. Mentoring has changed completely. These students don't have the same academic level, they don't have the family support, and our students require our attention, and we need them to adapt. This was this person's perception, because the institution was more intentional about making sure more students had an opportunity to engage. And this mentor was focused on the challenges and the changing realities as we are expanding access and we're providing more equitable opportunities. So this was what that person shared. The other thing is, and Maureen touched on this a little bit earlier when she said no one prepared her to be a mentor per se. There was no training. Like many of us may say the same thing for teaching. No one prepared us to teach. No one prepared us to mentor. And so this was someone that was over a program and was preparing folks to go into these contexts. And she said, so we start from day one, deconstructing those terms. And I think that the other piece is that I've been built out an entire training manual for individuals who are going to do research internationally. So I may not necessarily be going with those groups, but this is how I work and train the faculty and staff who are taking their students abroad. So it really does begin to defining terms, but also helping them understand, and this is critical, how we co-construct knowledge with our partners, how we respect the ways of knowing and being and unknowing with our partners, and how to check your own biases. And this, again, is something that this person had noticed wasn't necessarily the case, either with some of the students who are participating in global experiences, but particularly for those students that were going to do research in international context, and how it was absolutely critical that there was some sort of manual that those that were integrating these practices, they needed that preparation and they needed to know how to engage in these ways. And then finally, in terms of expected student outcomes, the mentors told us that, the expected outcomes range from career readiness to general life skills to intercultural competence to self-awareness to aspects of global learning. They saw all of these as expected outcomes for the experience, but how were students really preparing and how were they able to do it? So this one is students that I got a number of students from Colombia who followed up with me after the semester was over, which is hard, right? Because they're going to a new country, wanting to continue talking about their intercultural competence, seeing the assessment results, thinking of a plan for how to continue developing these things, thinking about grad school, more research questions and things like that, so that the work would continue even after that experience. So, one of the things, and we welcome just if you have any comments or thoughts now on how might the findings that this particular group found, how is that unique to the integration of these three practices? And do these findings resonate with your current work and what you're experiencing for those of you that are already doing this? And how have you navigated some of these aspects in your current work? How can we better prepare students, faculty, and staff on the receiving community, if you will, and at the university community? And how might you design an experience to address these findings to make sure that your students are able and are considering all of these aspects? So I don't know if there are any thoughts or comments now, but we welcome them.
Dawn, I'll just highlight that Mike has asked a question about cascading mentorship models, and it's not like we don't have to address it now, but I want to put that on folks' radar just to think, are there some models of really thoughtful multi-tier engagement groups? Oh, and I see Mike is unmuted, so maybe you'd like to talk for yourself, Mike.
Thanks, Sarah, for the opening. I developed a program at Cornell through the Laidlaw Scholars that we recruited 5 graduate mentors, and they each had a team of 5 undergraduate students. So we were able to scale and support 20 students who were doing research. Now, these students also had faculty mentors, and the graduate student's role was to help the undergrads critically reflect on their experiences. And to this question, right, that first bullet, I think critical reflection tends to cut across mentoring and undergraduate research and global learning. So, and I've just found for a unit that might be strapped for resources. I mean, luckily we were able to provide the graduate student mentors with a stipend, but they, I think, maybe benefited more than the undergrads. They were just raving about, like, we didn't get any training like this. This is so valuable to help us mentor undergraduates in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I love that, Mike. That's great. And I love that you are thinking, I would still say that's a constellation model, right? Like the faculty members are involved. So there's some work that has shown that triadic mentoring with the faculty mentor, the grad student, and the undergrad is particularly successful, that having the faculty member at least checking in is important. The faculty mentor gets too far removed from those equations, it's a little bit less successful sometimes. And I'm sure that varies widely depending on the context. But I love that you created that model. We don't have graduate students at Elon, but I use a similar model. I call it sort of almost like an apprenticeship, where the more experienced junior and senior students are helping the first and second years understand more, not only in my classroom, but in a lab, context in which they may be working on separate projects, but there's shared methodology, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, do we have anyone, and I'll mention this in just a few minutes, a little bit more, anyone who is part of the LSAMP program, the Lewis Stokes that, because in some of the projects I've seen at some institutions, they have had graduate students mentoring undergraduate students as well through that program. I don't know if anybody would like to share anything additional about that, but there are a lot of examples online we can share with you for the LSAMP program.
I'd like to give somebody else a shot, but if not, I do have an example. Okay, so we do. We have the LSAMP program, and we also have a women's initiative that is alumni from the institution that give small grants to be able to do impactful and innovation work. And a few years ago, a group that had gone through LSAMP and then had stayed on as graduate students pitched a program that was an embedded mentoring training program that put you together with a postdoc, a faculty member, a current graduate student, and an undergraduate student in these very meaningful connections. And it was one of the best experiences I've had here at WPI. So if others ever have like small grant funding at your institution to make something piloted and happen, that is a great way of doing it.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Any other comments? I'll move towards some inclusive practices. Okay. All right. So there was also a small team that focused on the inclusive practices. And so we looked specifically at how do we find ways to make sure that we are seeing full participation in these experiences. And so that was Caroline Ketchum from Elon, Andre Stevenson from Elizabeth City College, Matt Buckmaster, Elon, Elizabeth Froelich from the Forum on Education Abroad, Paul Miller of Elon, Laura DeZage of Penn State Altoona, and Mary Price of the Forum on Education Abroad. And so one of the things that we developed, and this was with the collective, the other authors of this publication, Maureen, Susan, Mary, and Kate and Chris, were design principles toward doing this work that relates to, and I have it on a slide, Hillary, I'll put that up there next. And you heard Maureen touch on this one, that's attending to one's positionality in knowledge production and use, and thinking about teaching and learning from a perspective of creation and transformation and who's involved. What are the roles that people are playing? How does that affect us? How do we avoid reproduction of epistemic forms of injustice through knowledge and expertise locally, globally, and internationally? Second, the importance of the concept of full participation. Again, moving beyond just saying, oh, we enrolled this number, but actually, how are people participating? Are they fully engaged? Are they successful in these experiences? And what does success mean? And again, the importance of looking at faculty, staff, and students, because we need to make sure that students are able to see themselves in their faculty, in their staff, in these experiences. And many of the institutions that we talked to and interviewed, they didn't quite see that in the experiences. And so they were working hard to find ways to engage and bring faculty and staff from diverse backgrounds into these experiences. And then finally, this, everyone in this group knows this well, the importance of ethical engagement and not just training on ethics, but deliberation, having those conversations, wrestling with these things that you have to. Jessica Rydell talks about rumbling, giving students opportunities to rumble with these concepts. And so they're thinking about these ethics, and then also examining themselves and what their values mean in different cultural perspectives and different disciplinary perspectives, and really making sure they have that time to consider it before they're in the field, if you will, so that they've thought about these things from other ways. And so when we looked at the goals obviously were to, find successful practices and examples. And, one of the things I'd like to point to first, and I use the term historical now because we're not quite sure where these programs and projects will go, but the National Science Foundation is one place that historically has done quite a bit of work that helped us figure out what are some strategies that are helpful in inclusive practices for undergraduate research, mentored undergraduate research in global context. One program that some of you may have been a part of, the Research Experiences for Undergraduates, NSF-wide, paid 8-week program. It's a mentored experience for students. And so students have support with finding projects as well. It's not just, go do this project. Secondly, IREX, the International Research Experiences for Students. Again, there's a really strong mentoring plan, and there are international mentors. Students, again, are paid. And so we were able to reach out and talk to some folks at NSF to pull out what are some of the strands that have made these programs successful. And you'll find that in the publication as well. And then the LSAMP, here's the long-awaited reveal, the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation. And so there are LSAMP centers around the country. There are 23 LSAMPs nationwide, or there have been. Thank you, Sarah, for putting that in there. 21 tribal serving institutions that have been a part of this. And so this, again, is another space that many folks have been looking at as ways to expand access, because they've been able to include a high percentage of students of color, students who haven't often participated in these experiences. And so we were able to pull information from these. One other resource, and I'll put this in the chat in a few minutes, that's another great resource, is this Broadening Participation of Underrepresented Minorities in STEM Research 2019. It came out of this convening of administrators, faculty, and students, many from so-called minority serving institutions, and it was all about diversity in STEM, but there's still something that you can take from it even if you're not in the STEM field, and we were able to pull information out there. So it's pretty clear that when you're looking at blending these experiences, funded experiences are essential. We know that students need the funding, and we know that it also makes it possible for students who may be coming from backgrounds where they can't afford to do it, or maybe where they have other experiences. We know this, but it's important that these experiences are funded, that we can find opportunities. There needs to be some formal mentoring, as we know. And if we want particularly to broaden participation, it has to be some sort of program. There has to be a specific process for it. And the informal mentoring does not work. It needs to be something formal where students know who their mentors are. There needs to be transparency at all stages. As we're offering these opportunities, it needs to be clear for all students how they can participate. It can't be sort of, oh, well, you have Professor MVP, as Maureen is called, so you're going to get to mentor, but you didn't know her, so you don't know the pathway. So we have to be transparent about these opportunities. And we also have to be transparent about what it means to do research in a global context. Some students may be concerned or may be fearful about doing that. They may not understand. We have to be transparent with them about what this means, how this works. And again, focusing on this emphasis on access and participation. We focus a lot on access, but we don't often spend as much time focusing on what that participation looks like. And then collaboration, and this is where it'll be helpful to hear your thoughts and comments, is how are you able to collaborate across the offices that are responsible for these dimensions? Perhaps you have an office that does mentoring. Perhaps you have an office that does global or international, and then a separate office that does undergraduate research. How are you able to bring these groups together? How are you able to start the conversation to say, is there a pool of funds that we can use to support this? Or I've got some funding for students to travel abroad, or I have some funding for students to do community engaged learning, but could we add a research dimension? So instead of thinking about it as just research or just global, how do we make sure that we're blending these opportunities, and how do we prepare faculty and staff in those areas for these types of experiences? I may be someone that has a lot of experience in a global context, but I don't know anything about undergraduate research. And what is it that will make me want to become a part of this and to collaborate in these ways? And again, this, I'm not going to spend too much time, but these are some of the institutions that we interviewed that had participation of students from diverse backgrounds, culturally, ethnically, students from diverse disciplinary perspectives. Some of them, particularly the Louisiana State model, they were able to draw they were able to pull in students from community colleges as part of theirs and saw it as sort of a pathway to the four-year institution. But again, we can share some examples and some of the strategies that they used as well. But these were some of the institutions, as I said, that we reviewed. Texas A&M is another one. They had a summer program, research program in Costa Rica, and they had a pathway also program for community college students that could participate in the summer program. Some of the students finished their degree at the community college, went on. Others that were looking for a four-year institution, that undergraduate research experience made them more interested in continuing on for the 4-year, and they went on to Texas A&M. So before we're ready for some conversation, but just putting it all together, these are some of the broader implications for practice that we love hearing your comments on. One is engaging the full constellation of mentors and community partners. And that's something that some folks in the global space may say, oh, we know the importance of community partners, but how are we engaging them as mentors in this process? How are they on equal footing, if you will, of their faculty member at their institution? How are we making sure that that's happening? How are we preparing students for their roles and responsibilities as both being a guest and also being a co-creator, that expectation for students? How are we assisting students to navigate the ways that their experiences may alter their understanding of their own identities and positionalities? I think we've made that pretty clear. That's important. And how are we making long-standing relationships in these contexts? And I think independently we know this, but how are we doing this? Particularly sometimes in a global context, it can be more of a challenge if there is a distance in terms of where this is happening. How are we making sure that there's consistent, constant engagement with the folks we're working? How do we prepare students to manage difficulties that arise from the intersection of viewpoints and backgrounds in these environments? What is it like to do research in a community versus being a part of a community? Are students prepared for being a researcher in these contexts, and have we prepared them for that? And then finally, helping to make sure that students see the living, breathing dynamics of the dimensions of these contexts. And so we'd like to open up for conversation. I don't know if Maureen wanted to pose an initial question, but we welcome your thoughts, ideas, reactions, and then we'll get back to what you wanted to learn and did we get there, and how can we get there?
Well, I think it's great. Let's open it up.
I'll just remind folks, either feel free to unmute and share, or if you're feeling a little shy and would like to pop something in the chat, we can also route as well. So feel free to engage as you most feel comfortable. We will be sharing the slides and the recording as well afterwards. So this isn't the last time you'll see this wonderful information.
I also just want to remind people, Dawn and I pulled a lot of this from the national report that is widely available, free, open access. You just have to log in, I believe, right, Dawn, to the AAC&U website, and you should be able to find it. But if you have trouble, reach out to either of us, and it has more details than what we've been able to share here today.
If there's not a formal question, so please interrupt me if there is. I don't want to stop, but I'm seeing one thing that someone put in the Miro board is they wanted to learn how to make a pitch as a staff member to faculty about encouraging or deepening the global context and community engagement in relationship to their mentored undergraduate research proposals or process. I don't know, Maureen, if you would like to speak to that. I'm happy to offer thoughts as well. But maybe we'll start with that because there are a couple of others that are, that align with that question as well.
That's a great question. I'm curious. I'd love to hear more from everybody else. We've done a lot of talking, but I'll just quickly say student ambassadors, or however we want to talk about them, are so convincing when they share the experiences that they've had and what they've learned. And even, what didn't work well. We had some students who wanted to put together a little video called What to Know Before You Go, but that could also be used to encourage faculty participation. I do think it's challenging, and somebody else asked about compensation models. So if this is not part of your work, it's very hard to take on. So I could say a lot more. I'm going to pause because I see Mike has his hand up, and then maybe others of you want to jump in who have experience at different institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Maureen and Dawn. Great presentation. I am curious about mentoring as leadership. And so I think about, is that a separate field, and is there a high impact practice around student leadership development? I actually think it's the pinnacle of leadership is mentoring, because anyone can be great because anyone can mentor, to paraphrase MLK. So I'm just curious about that on the one hand. And then just to note, the collaborative does have a global engagement survey, and this is the second time it's come up for me as we're thinking about revamping the global engagement survey, which is validated, adding a module about undergraduate research experiences that faculty or staff could plug in or not use if they're not doing mentoring. So that's on my mind too. And I'm just curious if you see promise in something like that.
I mean, I would definitely say yes. I love that idea. I also, mentoring is threaded through our quality indicators and our thinking, but is it its own high impact practice? I don't know. But is it part of leadership? Of course. It's hard to imagine what it isn't. When you start to get a little confusion when you start to say mentoring is advising, it's different than teaching, it's different than advising, of course. So how do we understand mentoring relationships and their value? I think I've thought a lot about that. Happy to say more. But Hillary, you had your hand up. Let's hear from you.
Yes, this is so insightful and useful for me, and I wish my staff were here. So just briefly, we have a graduate level, it's not an undergraduate level, it's a graduate level micro-credential in the Foundations of Global Research, where we touch on a lot of these issues, but for graduate students. And these are graduate students, mostly doctoral students throughout the university who are just embarking on their graduate research. And a couple of points that I want to make. One is that the focus in the micro-credential is on the students, and we have found that there is a real hunger for this kind of work, focusing on, what do you do when you have global research? What do you, what do you pay attention to? What are the theories out there? And a real hunger to be in a community. The other thing I want to say is we don't at all focus in this micro-credential on the mentoring aspect. So this is like blowing my mind, and how can we do this? And in fact, we used to give funding to faculty to do this kind of mentoring, and we found that it was more productive for us to give funding to students. So that then becomes a question. To give the funding to students who then find mentors. So I'll leave it there and pose that as a question. Have you considered that, or what do you think about that, of funding students who then go and find mentors and work with them?
And in that model, the mentors are not compensated?
The mentors are not compensated. No.
I think the summer undergraduate research models almost always have compensation for both or all members of a group. So I think there is probably an equity issue there. Also, how much mentoring is a very intensive and time-consuming process. So to do it well, high quality, it needs to be part, in my strong opinion, it needs to be part of your work.
Yeah.
So
So how do you get it as part of your work unless you have money to pay people? That's where I go to the time and labor issue.
Yep.
How
Yep.
in the world are faculty or staff going to have the bandwidth to do this mentoring unless they're paid?
Part of the institutional culture, part of the valuing. Dawn, I'm going to jump to you because you've had experience with a breadth of institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I just want to go back to the concept of having students find their own mentors. Some of the research has shown that is not particularly useful for students of color, for women in STEM, and for others that are underrepresented in particular fields, because they tend to have challenges in some cases relating and connecting with faculty, and some of them will just say, I'm not going to do it, then I'm going to opt out. And so by having that be a part of the experience, that also helps increase participation and from an inclusive perspective. But I think, as Maureen says, yes, if you can have constant compensation, that works best. But also, is it part of the culture? Is it something that faculty and staff are expected to do? Is it something that you can build into the work? So it takes time for it to become part of it. But Maureen is exactly right. I think, we've had these similar conversations about global experiences. They tend to take more. There's a deeper expectation when you're teaching a course in a community context or a global context. You're inherently going to be doing more work. And so as those become part of the institutional fabric, you find some institutions, I think about FIU, as you all, developed, your robust global learning program, there were more opportunities for it. But we, from what we've seen in the institutions we've worked with, it absolutely has been something where there is a need for that compensation. So it sometimes takes time. Some have done it with pilot groups. I've seen some that have done communities of practice where there was a small pool of funds for a year or two. They said, we're going to look at bringing these practices together. As you know, sometimes it's just an offering. It doesn't reflect the actual amount of money that you should get for the time, but it's the act of the institution giving you something. So I think those are a few ways that I've seen folks start, doing that before they had the full blown, funding, or the context like, Elon, where that's an expectation. It's part of your job to do that.
And Sarah, you have a lot to say, I'm sure, on this as well. It's very much in the fabric at WPI.
It is very much in the fabric. And that's where I have a little bit of tension between like what is also really high quality support as a faculty, because I can speak from a faculty role. Like I expect to be an excellent mentor and to seek out those things. I don't expect to be compensated for it. And if people are going above and beyond and it's an equity standpoint, then absolutely we should. So I think that we've hit a really nice balance here at WPI because we have, like Dawn was mentioning, professional learning communities that are faculty staff that can come together around specific issues, try new initiatives, et cetera. But then I think also within our tenure and promotion for faculty, being a great mentor, educational innovations, support, you have to articulate that very clearly, and that is prized in how you're reviewed. So there's like multiple ways of like, if not compensation, then at least acknowledgement, raising that up, prizing that as an institution, and making sure that folks know that that's part of our value set. So I think it's a both and. I think I just externally processed a little bit there, but yeah, but those are the things that are in my mind.
Hi, everybody. I just want to introduce myself and jump into the conversation as well. So much of what has been shared really resonated with me in terms of building and designing a student leadership program and focusing on global leadership and social justice. I'm at Tulane University, and I'm in my second year now at the university, but I have a strong background in international development. So higher ed is pretty new and just kind of sorting out how do we prepare our students for entering into a global market and thinking about what's happening on the DEI side and taking that pivot for culture, humility, and competency into the global leadership space. I also have one of my colleagues on this call as well. We're looking at different models to design our programs, and the colleague that's on focuses on study abroad, and I'm in social justice and student leadership space with the global lens. And if not, and right now I'm looking at piloting an open global research lab for our undergrad students connected to our global leadership cohort program. And if not the compensation piece, because I'm not compensated for doing this piece, but it is a lever for community engaged research that we're doing. So it's a reciprocal relationship, and we're looking at, right now I've talked with the city of New Orleans, the cultural tourism division, as well as nonprofits that focus on global leadership and inviting global leaders to New Orleans to focus on various aspects, whether it's antiquities or water, whatever it might be, and other nonprofits that focus on global diplomacy exchange, and the university and some of our other programs, just to kind of look at a comprehensive research space where we can do sort of like a ROI of international relations for New Orleans. Something that actually makes an impact, and we're operating out of the Center for Public Service at Tulane, which focuses on community partnerships and the university. So it's at a pilot phase because I don't have the full funding for it, nor can I show like this is the value of something like this. And we're still looking at other faculty members to maybe come on board with this project, or even the pilot, if you will. But we've done a lot of research around the ROI of Mardi Gras, but we haven't looked at our international relations and our sister cities partnerships and what does that mean for the city. And so a lot of what is shared, the models and the information, I think would be really helpful to us as we're trying to go forward with putting something to the university as well as to our staff and our faculty around why this pilot would be beneficial and who could be potential partners in it. Again, just introducing myself. This is very new. We're just looking at different cohorts that might be in the same space as us. Thank you for the information. And any feedback, any thoughts would be super.
I'm just going to say quickly, I look to Dawn, but I love everything you said. I mean, you've just built this ecological model looking at, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I love this Yuri Bronfenbrenner's kind of, these ecosystems that are working together. So even within your institution, you're creating these partnerships and collaborations. And so these are also constellations of support, and then really involving communities in such meaningful ways. So I applaud what you're doing, and I hope the report could be useful in terms of models and maybe even pointing to, as you need to show, the value of this work. Certainly there's national recognition of the value of this work, so maybe that could be helpful. But Dawn, what about you? What do you think?
No, I just think it's great. I think it's wonderful, the blending, the connection with the city. They're very early in the stages, and I don't know that they would have as much to offer you, but I know Bennett College was starting to develop, some of these things, connecting the community. They participated in a summer institute with us a couple of summers ago. If we can connect, and I can put you in touch with the person there to see where they are, but that was one of the places that came to mind in terms of curriculum too, as you were mentioning that curricular piece. I think broadly, as you're talking about, you're partnering with the person from Study Abroad, you're coming at this from the social justice perspective. Tony Pender at Emerson College, they might also be a good place to look, because within their framing of their global experiences, it's rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so they have that lens in all that they do, and they have a social justice perspective. So it's not just DEI broadly, whatever you want to call it, but there's also a deep social justice lens. So they could be a place. And I know they've done quite a bit with the city of Boston, but I also know some of their international sites. I believe they have been looking more closely at how they can really be embedded in those cities and what's happening, because they have a year-round person on the ground in those spaces. So that's just one. Those are two, folks that, as you're seeking community in this space, that those might be a couple of places you can look for collaboration. But I was jotting it down. I look forward to seeing how you're able to develop this. I think it's amazing.
Coming along. We just got to get out of Super Bowl and Mardi Gras, and then I think the city will focus back on us.
Yes.
Some good problems.
Thank you. What a great space. I'm so glad that I found this.
Thank you for introducing yourself and your projects. Sarah, ask a good question. I'm not going to say that I can answer it, but I want to lift it up. Yeah, the potential for community leaders as co-mentors. Absolutely. It comes back to, is this part of the work you're doing as well? I think Hillary had to jump off, but this idea of valuing people's work. We have very active community engagement here, but we have to pay close attention to what our partners need, as we all know, and just also the time it takes to work intensively with students. That is not part of everyone's work. And so making sure that we're thinking about that carefully.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I love that. One of the things that we do have here in the center is a community engaged scholar in residence, and phenomenal resource to community and just a cultural blueprint for the city. So thank you very much for adding that piece in there.
And if anyone else, please feel free to come off mute, introduce yourself, your project as well. We know that the learning really comes from each other.
Hi, I'm Felicia. I'm at the University of Notre Dame. I work with our justice education programs, both in the US and internationally. But just to share a little bit about what I'm thinking about right now. So part of my role is to develop the structures for this constellation to happen. So for students to connect with the peers, to connect with their site partners, to have a faculty mentor, for everyone to have like, you know, a similar ethic and vision, as well as like clear expectations, all that good stuff, right? But I really am so committed to the longstanding relationship piece and how to, I think we could do a better job with this. How do we build off each year's research projects and make a continuum throughout the years? Our faculty mentors often don't necessarily know who our community partners are. We match them with students based on their area of expertise and their interests, but there's sometimes a disconnect, and I kind of think that's okay because I don't want to overburden our site partners. So there's like that tension too for me, but also I think if they did know the site partners, that would be ideal because they'd be able to advise our students so much better. So anyhow, I'm just thinking about all those different, how to manage all this constellation and to do it in a way that really respects the long-standing partnerships. So if you have any thoughts or advice on that, I would love it.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I mean, I don't know. So in terms of the projects, is there any continuity of the projects the students are doing over the years? Because I think of one, this is it's an example of MUR-GC or You Are Magic, which I like. At Lehigh University, they have something called the Mountaintop Initiative, and I'm not saying wholesale, but I think one of the things that they have done well is that the projects continue over the years. So there may be a particular project and item that students are working on, again, interdisciplinary teams of students, but it doesn't end at the semester or it doesn't end at the 6-week period. So another team of students comes in, they, or not even a whole team sometimes, like you may replace 2 or 3 students on a team. And so I wonder if there's a model like that where there's some continuity of the project over the years that can be helpful with what's being done in the community. I've seen this from the health sciences perspective at Indiana University. They have a big initiative called AMPATH, the Academic Model for the Prevention and Treatment of HIV. And there are a lot of moving pieces with that, but there are continuous projects. So students from Indiana, students from Brown, other places. So the key is having that project and some key people in place long term, but the student roles may change over the years. But I know, Sarah, you, I'm sure, have something to add to that as well.
Sure. I mean, I'm very familiar with the Lehigh approach, and I know that their work with there was a prison theater project that every year it kind of remakes itself, but they've got long-term partners. The other piece that I wanted to highlight from WPI is we've got project centers around the world. And each project center has a director who is a faculty or staff director who has long-standing partnerships in that community. So even though new students are coming every year and it's only for 7 or 8 weeks at a time, they do have the sponsors are the ones that kind of they get compensated. They also have these students that work on projects that matter and that advance some of their goals, and they're the ones dictating what the projects are, how they engage. So it's a long-standing partnership. It's constant critical reflection, and there's always kind of a debrief at the end. How did this go? What do we do for the future? How do we continue to make sure that the students are also well prepared and ethically grounded before coming into the experience? So at scale, that's why I came to WPI. It was very exciting to join something that had that kind of formality to it.
I
And
think,
Felicia, I asked one of, sorry, Maureen, I just want to ask one other quick question. And again, I know things have changed at Notre Dame. This may have been 10 years ago when I was there. We were working with some folks at what was then the Center for Social Concern.
Yep.
And they had, okay, and I remember there was a partners meet, you know, there were, I think it was Rachel Thomas Morgan who was involved
Yep.
in some of that. Okay.
Mhm.
And so I know there were some pieces in place then that may not be. I know things have evolved. So happy to continue talking about that. But Maureen, please go ahead, because I know there were some pieces in place that helped with that continuity for a site that someone went every year, you know, which can be a challenge.
Exactly. Yep.
I just wanted to highlight that Sarah's example just shows the importance of institutional cultural support again, that there's systemic support there. And so that's really important to do these sustained projects. And then Felicia, I love the way you gently said, hey, wouldn't it be great if the faculty were involved with these community partners at least? So everybody is, so what's the value of a constellation model? I mean, the highest value, I think, would be that there is some sort of collaboration, even if it's minimal, even if it's annual. I mean, some way that people are sharing expertise, because we would all benefit from that. And I'd be surprised if people didn't recognize that. Could that be one lunch where we at least meet and talk, or some beginnings of that you then again build that culture where, I'm not isolating myself as an academic expert who doesn't understand the community orientation and the host partners. So I would encourage you. I love that idea. And maybe the constellation model, I'd be happy to send you things, would give you ways to say, hey, we're going to try this model. And, we're not going to ask that you know everything you do as partner, but there's going to be this opportunity, and people would see that then as a professional development opportunity, perhaps.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you. I think we have several different iterations of all of this. So like the courses that are 3 credits taught by faculty who's committed to the model, those seem to be like longstanding partnerships where the research continues and is ongoing. But then we have these summer programs, right, where we have 200 students going around the US and around the world. And those are a little bit harder to manage in that sense. But that's the hope, that we could still bring that kind of quality and depth to those experiences as well, so that they're integrated and, yeah. So anyhow, I appreciate this conversation.
Just lift up Mike's comment. The students have to have agency, but also to remind us what Don has said, which is students come differentially prepared / received. And so, and I just also, one of the things we learned about mentoring and constellations is we have to keep thinking about multiple pathways. Like one experience is not going to be a mentoring relationship for a student. So even our first year programs, we're not going to catch all of them. And so having multiple ways, peer mentoring for some, we've developed composites based on the research. I interviewed over 100 people, faculty, staff, and students, and just was able to see these different kinds of patterns. So again, just thinking about this with complexity, that's the hard part. It's never going to be the same for 2 people. So how do we understand how to help students develop their constellation, develop agency? And I think we're all still working on that, but understanding that there's multiple pathways, that people need different types of support seems really at the heart of it.
Thank you. And Sarah, it's funny. I was just putting this list of tools in the chat, and the one you shared there. So just again, some additional resources that could be helpful for some of the things that you all have described. Of course, the first, that Sarah mentioned from the collaborative. The second, there are a couple of resources from the Forum on Education Abroad, guidelines for undergraduate research, field studies. And then the forum has some resources on independent study for students, and then also community engaged learning. And then CIMER's mentoring curriculum is one also that we put in the chat too.
All right. I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left, so there's still time for one more question or sharing. If folks out there haven't had the chance to be heard so far today, this is your invitation.
Can I come back with one more?
Absolutely.
Question? So in addition to my role here, we also have an anti-racist leadership program for leaders on campus. And our leadership cohort, every year, you have to do some type of capstone work. And the group that I'm a part of has decided that they want to take their funds, which is $6,000, to create a like micro grant program for BIPOC students who want to study abroad. But that's the things that are around. So you win the award, you get the trip, but there are things that you need to prepare for the trip, whether it's backpack, books, those kinds of things. And so we're looking for a way to sort of create this program so that it's equitable, put some type of rubric where students can apply to the funds, and other programs or partnerships across the university can match our funds so that we can keep this 6,000 going. Anybody have anything like that, or any type of model that supports a rubric for justification? And it could be across the board in anything, whether it's social justice or some type of other program that they're applying to based upon their focus. Or have you heard of anything sort of like this?
So this might not be exactly what you're seeking. It's not at all, but I'm thinking in terms of a resource. Pitt had developed a rubric that had a social justice component to it that could be useful in this kind. It was a global learning rubric, if you will, but social justice was one of the categories. So I'm thinking it's something that could be applied, that might be useful, not in terms of programs. But let me see if I can find, I thought I had it handy, but I'm not seeing it now, and it's not coming up on their website. So that's something, again, I'm answering a quarter of your question, but it's something that could be useful in that space.
And even if supporting students, do you find that a fund like this would be beneficial?
Absolutely. I know I'm part of a women's philanthropy circle that's affiliated with the university. And one of the grants we got was from the Office of Diversity, Equity, Multicultural Affairs, what the institution calls it. And it was to fund suitcases for students. They had a scholarship program for first generation students who were participating in study abroad for the first time. And some of them did not have suitcases. And so the idea was they expanded it to be a travel kit. So it was a suitcase, it was a waist belt, it was, all of these other components that weren't part of the scholarship, that the students got the scholarship that covered getting your passport, getting your visa, but not those dimensions. So that's something, but I think they did theirs kind of as a first come, first serve. It wasn't a competitive process for students, because it had just started.
Okay, thank you.
We have something similar. We have the Global Scholars Fund, which is it issues small grants for students on financial need, if to like offset the cost. So it might be they're going to be gone for a semester, they're not going to have work study. So how can we, they could apply for a grant to make up some of that, also for visas and passports, because those are not included with us. But that's been really successful for us. And it is a competitive process in that it's an opportunity for us to also talk about things like the Gilman Award and how to, it's sort of scaffolding. How do you seek out funding and how do you fill out applications? And we offer support for applying for those things. So it's sort of, we suggest that they apply for those.
Okay, that's perfect. That's exactly it. Thank you.
And I just want to say, oh no, we're at time. I was going to say, I also agree. I wondered if anybody had anything that Maureen mentioned to support students that are participating in conferences and things like that, because that's also important. I didn't know if others had examples of that.
Our Dean of the College Office has grants for that, and we do have some for international. So I'm in the Center for Global Study and Engagement, so our funding goes to international experiences. And we do have small grants for that. We're also developing short-term travel programs that are for spring break in order to increase access to students for global learning experiences open to all majors. And I'm trying to bring faculty in to lead those so that we're tying them together with locations where we also have international internships based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the summers. So we're trying to build long-term relationships with the locations that we're sending our students.
Okay, that's great. I keep y'all on speed dial.
I know, right? Well, that's a perfect segue. So we're going to close out. You've given us an hour and a half of your time that has just been a pleasure. It's really flown by. I want to thank Dawn and Maureen for sharing and the wonderful things that you have. I know Mike has put in some links to things that are happening around the collaborative. So I just want to say, this is a supportive, nurturing, wonderful space to share ideas and to get some collective impact around how we can support our students and each other in this work that we're doing when it probably feels, I mean, it is under threat in a lot of ways. So just knowing that this is a supportive group that will continue to meet over time, webinars, drop-in hours, our in-person things as well. Please just keep on our mailing list, make sure that you know what's coming up, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if there are things that you want to suggest or ways that you want to work with us more deeply. So with that, thank you all so much. Stay
Yes,
healthy.
thank you. Thank you for coming. John and I love this work, as you can tell, so we're happy to chat in other ways.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
All right, take